Chapter 10: The Agrarian Problem and the District. The Agrarian Reform Commission, under the presidency of Senator Glinka, ex-adjutant to the Ministry of Agriculture and ex-director of the Emigration Department, had begun its work in Yalta in cooperation with an Agrarian Reform Commission and a special committee in Simferopol, and was working very actively. But from the beginning, a storm of discussion had arisen over the commission's scope. The press, representatives of the democratic societies, and the conservative, supporters of big landed estates, had all stated their own particular point of view with considerable violence. Some claimed recognition of the conquests of the revolution and the free reallotment amongst the poor peasants of all land belonging to the state or private owners. Others did not favor forcible appropriation, but wanted compensation for the dispossessed, declaring that property is sacred, and that restrictions of any kind imposed on big properties could only hinder the economic regeneration of the country. It was not easy for the Commission to proceed with its work in such an atmosphere of discord, especially as its members were themselves in disagreement. The Commission did not consider itself competent to settle the agrarian question for the whole of Russia, and furthermore, it was not capable of estimating the influence that certain agricultural measures would have on the fight against Bolshevism under prevailing revolutionary conditions. In its efforts to steer a middle course and find some sort of solution, the Commission confined its work to elaborating measures which applied only to the Crimea, especially to the northern districts which were rich in land, and which were adapted to local needs. Newspapers mentioning the work of the Agrarian Commission found their way across the Red Frontier. Peasants from the southern districts of northern Taurida sneaked across the frontier and came to Sebastopol. They told us something about the situation and the opinion of the peasants beyond the frontier. They wanted to know how the new commander-in-chief proposed to deal with the land question and the problem of local government. I invited some who called themselves representatives of the peasant soviets to come and see me, and I had a long and detailed interview with them. Later, I ordered Senator Glinka to coordinate and tabulate their demands so that the Commission could take them into account, provided that they were not opposed to any of our general principles. The peasants told me that the whole population of their district was tired of the Soviet system and communism. All, that is, except the beggars and the disorderly elements. The peasants wanted peace, order, and a normal state of affairs to be restored to the countryside. They wanted laws concerning the land and self-government to be promulgated, putting local government and the administration of the land into their own hands. They promised to act wisely, economically, and justly, without cheating anyone or destroying the large landed estates which were still intact. On these conditions only, they declared, would the peasants agree to recognize the cause of the Russian army as their own and as the national popular cause. These interviews caused me to make up my mind. I immediately told Senator Glinka to draft an agrarian law as soon as he could and indicated its main outlines to him. A glance at the general situation will show the urgent need there was for these measures. Throughout the territory, which had been occupied for nearly a year by the volunteer army, as well as throughout that which had not come under General Denikin's legislative measures, total uncertainty reigned as to the legal situation, whilst lack of security in the countryside had led to complete economic disorder. The revolutionary wave which had engulfed the landed property of the nobility had also demolished the bases of the agrarian organization of pre-revolutionary Russia. It had swept away the estate-owning aristocrats, but at the same time, it had torn the small peasant proprietors from their small plots of land, ruined the farmers, disorganized lease arrangements, and carried to the height of their power those obscure forces which called themselves the poor peasantry. These creatures preyed on the countryside, terrorizing all the hard-working populace, and relied for support on the Soviet power. Abstract considerations on one side, actual conditions did not at the moment permit of a restoration of the old system, pure and simple. The old arrangements were all disorganized, the evaluations destroyed, and the conditions of recruitment of manual labor changed. There was no longer any standard for the assessment of rural leases, whilst the personal safety of country landowners was by no means assured. The prime necessity was to reinstate the hard-working peasants and set them up on their land again, to weld them together and rally them to the defense of order and national principles. It was an especially good opportunity to make a favorable impression on the peasants and snatch away the enemy's principal weapon of propaganda against the White Army and its cause. We had to allay the peasants' suspicion that our object in fighting the Reds was no other than to restore the rights of the great landed proprietors and take reprisals against those who had infringed these rights. I decided on the plan of publishing a prikaz concerning the land, based on the pressing needs of life, as I had already defined them in my dispatch of April 8th. This prikaz had to be elaborated, promulgated, and executed without further delay if the peasants were to know what the Russian army, which was freeing them from the Bolshevist yoke, could and would do for them. The White Movement had to define its attitude to the agrarian question in an unmistakable manner and emphasize the sincerity of the national power's intentions. The fundamental principles of the reform were set out later in some of my dispatches. The land for the people and liberty in the structure of the state, prikaz of May 20th, number 3226. And again, the owners of the land shall direct local administration and be responsible for its management and good order, prikaz of July 15th, number 94. As soon as he received my instructions and official order, Senator Glinka proceeded with the work I had entrusted to him and soon finished it. Towards the middle of May, the first drafts of the land and local government laws were ready, and I had ratified them. Later, they were discussed by my council under my presidency. By May 18th, G.V. Glinka had communicated his drafts to the members of the council, and I suggested that they should express their opinion on the main points. Opinions differed very much. The majority were alarmed by the size of the task and feared the obstacles that stood in the way of its realization. Only the military members of the council, who reflected the opinion of the army and were supported by the commanders of the troops at the front, fully realized the important psychological effects that the immediate promulgation of this measure would have on the army and the civil population. Avai Krivochain arrived 2 days later, and he too understood the psychological importance of the decision I had taken. Here again, he displayed his keen sense of political realities and the elasticity of his mind. "This draft is far from perfect," said M. Krivochain, "but it will make the success of the army easier and will win the sympathies of the peasants. Since the army is expecting a decisive pronouncement on the agrarian question, there is no time to be lost. Life itself will add all the necessary amendments in the future." He did insist, however, that the prikaz concerning the land should be published in the form of a dispatch, and advised me to call the agrarian commissions provided for in the law Agrarian Soviets. A dispatch drawn up in the martial atmosphere of a military camp was not expected to be so perfect in form as a law promulgated under normal conditions. The prikaz concerning the land was published on May 25, 1920, together with an official communique giving a detailed explanation of the causes and conditions which had inspired its promulgation and indicating its tenor and importance. It was promulgated, together with the regulations and the temporary statute which was attached to it, on June 27th in a slightly altered form. It was done by means of a ukase of the Senate, which was functioning as 3 departments. It had been reconstituted in the Don area under General Denikin's government and had since been transferred to Yalta. The Senate had deemed it useful to add the following declarations to its ukase. The prikaz of the regent, who possesses plenary powers, gives the land to its cultivators, who will till it in perpetual hereditary ownership, but they are not to obtain it free of all charge. The new owners will have to pay the state, who will reserve the proceeds as compensation for the old owners. Such a process of change, redivision, and final reallotment of the land fits in with our people's conception of justice and with the historical development of imperial agrarian legislation. From now on, a regular agrarian system and the material well-being of the workers on the land will be assured to the countryside. The new law will be executed with the cooperation of the cultivators themselves, under the supreme control of the regent and commander-in-chief. The object of the agrarian law is the general welfare of the state, and it will serve as the basis of Russia's economic power. Henceforth, the disputes, the discontent, the many dissensions over the agrarian question will be silenced. Every loyal son of our martyred country is bound not only by law but by conscience to use all his strength and wisdom to forget his personal interests and cooperate with the regent and commander-in-chief in putting the land law into effect as quickly and as completely as possible. The entire agrarian reform was based on one idea: the consolidation of the law of private property without distinction of social class. It is true that a change of owners was provided for. Landed property was to undergo a new division because national interest always takes precedence over the interests of private property. Nevertheless, the new agrarian system was based on the solid bond which binds the owner to his land, his right of ownership, which not only leaves him in safe possession to enjoy it, but gives him the right to dispose of it freely. Furthermore, until an effective redivision took place, he had the right to ask for an allotment of his part of the land. All the land which passed to the owner cultivators was to become their own property on condition that they paid an indemnity to the state. This was assessed at a rate favorable to the purchasers and gave wide facilities for easy payment. The selecting of the landowners who had the right to share in the redivision of land and the fixing of the maximum size of the lots was to be done by the local representatives of the land, the agrarian soviets of each district. The composition of these soviets was such that the peasant proprietors, the most stable element of the rural population, acquired a decisive voice in the adaptation of the law to local economic conditions. The prikaz concerning the land, therefore, rejected the idea of making a general reallotment of the land or of making a free gift of it. It did not promise a portion of land to everybody who wanted some, nor did it undertake to transform the whole rural proletariat into landowners, not to mention the urban proletariat who had lost all contact with agriculture. Furthermore, it negatived the idea of a redistribution of all the land on a national scale, aiming at the equality of all cultivators, and provided for in one law applicable to every province of Russia. On the contrary, each district was to decide for itself the question of redistribution of land within its own boundaries. This local character was the outstanding characteristic of the prikaz and combined all the practical advantages as well as the disadvantages of the system. It was the very opposite of those huge, unrealizable schemes for a general redistribution of all the land amongst all the people, which would necessitate the forcible transfer of great masses of the rural population from north to south and from west to east, across 1/6 of the surface of the globe. Because no maximum size for property had been fixed, the possibility of retaining some of the old estates cropped up, especially if, in the opinion of the people of a district, local conditions demanded their maintenance in the interests of internal peace and the stability of the local economic system. The actual holders of the land, coming within the scope of the prikazy, were to pay their redemption fee into the treasury in corn or coin. Payments were due from the moment when the prikaz was applied to the land of a given district, without waiting for the completion of all the formalities of consolidation. These payments were to be discharged afterwards by installments to be fixed when the property was consolidated, and were to continue until the sum due to the state for the repurchase of the land had been paid off. In the case of non-payment after a specified period, the plot of ground, consolidated or not, which was held by a defaulter, was to be handed over to another by permission of the Agrarian Soviet, and this new holder could claim consolidation of the property for himself, Arts 8 and 10 of the prikaz. The head of the financial department was requested to draw up and present to the commander-in-chief for ratification with all possible speed a draft of the bases for the assessments, the formulae and time limits which were to govern the relations between the state financiers and the owners who took over land, expropriation, and ways of recovery by the treasury of sums of money used in this relationship. This question of payments seemed to be the only one which would provoke some discontent. The peasants had nothing against the principle of repurchase, but they did not appreciate the advantages to themselves and the disadvantages to the state involved in the system of payment in corn, and insisted that the repurchase prices were too high and must be reduced. The methods for applying the prikaz were planned on the one hand to avoid any arbitrary proceedings against those who had taken possession of the land during the revolution, and to prevent any future illegal seizure, and on the other, to enable the reform to be carried through with the minimum amount of damage to rural economy, which was still sound in some places, and without mining existing cultivation or decreasing the agricultural output. Paragraph I of the Prikazi enunciated the principle that in the regions occupied by the Russian army, all de facto possession of agricultural land, independently of its legal title and the person of the possessor, is to be protected against violent seizure. All land is to remain in the possession of those who are working it or using it in any other way. Thus, the land law could be applied automatically to the whole area occupied by the Russian army from the moment of its submission to the authority of the commander-in-chief, without a special order being enacted. Existing de facto possession was declared inviolable. It was the starting point for all subsequent applications of the prikaze. In accordance with the temporary statute of agrarian institutions, each district agrarian soviet was to be composed of 5 or 10 members, whom the district agrarian assemblies were to elect. The members themselves were to elect one of their number as president. The officials, such as the surveyors and agronomists, were to be attached to the agrarian soviets as their technical advisors, but they were to have only consultative powers. Temp. Stat. Arts 256 and 8. The district agrarian soviets, under the presidency of the local agrarian mediator, were to be composed of the president of the zemstvo of the same district, the justice of the peace, a delegate from the Ministry of Finance, and at least 4 representatives elected by the district agrarian assemblies. Temp. Stat. Art 10. To these 2 institutions, one composed exclusively of representatives of the local population, and the other of more than half, I gave the widest powers for the application of the prikazi. They were to settle every question, oversee the organization of inquiries, fix standards, settle cultivators' rights to the confirmation of their claims of ownership, redistribute the land, set up boundaries between the allotments, return to its lawful owner land which had been acquired illegally, and do a dozen other things. So that the central authorities should retain sufficient influence over the course of the reform, it was stipulated that the decisions of the district agrarian soviets could be annulled by their superiors, the provincial authorities, but only in case of a breach of the general laws and by order of the administration, or in the lawful interests of private persons, society, or the state. Temp. Stat. Art 14. The prikaze, therefore, very effectively submitted the whole agrarian problem to the decision of the agricultural population itself. The functions of the government officials, who were to superintend agrarian questions, and of the official mediators for the districts and provinces, were limited to consolidating the work of the district agrarian institutions and supporting them in their activities so long as these were within the law. On July 15th, my prikaze concerning the local zemstvo was published. Prikaz issued by the Regent and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. Sino 94, July 15 to 28, 1920. Civil Branch of the Administration. The remission of the land in full ownership to the cultivators who work on it, and the division of the great estates into small holdings, necessitates a modification of the structure of the zemstvo. The large new class of small landowners drawn from the erstwhile laboring class must be given a part in the difficult and responsible work of restoring the zemstvos to regular working order again. Those with land are to control local institutions and be responsible for their good order and management. I consider that only a zemstvo organization based on this principle can be of any real help in the rebuilding of the state. I am convinced that the great mass of the peasants who are now called upon to play a predominating part in the new organization of the zemstvos will respond unanimously to this appeal, using their best efforts for the work, and will collaborate in the work I require of them for the welfare of their country. Until some national power can promulgate a general and definitive statute concerning the Zemstvo, this temporary statute is to be introduced into all territory occupied by the troops of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. General Wrangel, Senator Glinka. The elaboration of the regulations for the Constitution was worked out in cooperation with representatives from the Zemstvos, together with several experts. The leading ideas of the prikaz concerning the land were expounded in a masterly fashion in an interview which my adjutant M. Krivochain, ex-minister of Agriculture, gave to the editor of a newspaper called the Velikaya Rossiya. It appeared in the form of an editorial called Launched on the Agricultural Campaign. The Commander-in-Chief, said M. Krivochain, is calling new forces into free and creative action. He is posing the question of decentralization of local administration on a huge scale, for a large new class of small landowners has been created and consolidated by the prikaz concerning the land. I have certain knowledge that these measures, together with other circumstances, have induced France to recognize our government, and General Denikin could not obtain this recognition even when his troops had advanced as far as Orel, nor Admiral Kolchak when he was master of all Siberia. The prikaze concerning the land obliges us to proceed to a second measure, the reorganization of the administration and the local zemstvo. The Commander-in-Chief has boldly decided to give the small peasant proprietor a share in the control of the local zemstvos. The modest title of this law somewhat obscures the enormous importance of the general reform of the zemstvos which we have planned. The revolution has uprooted all the foundations and modified all the conditions of life. We realize clearly that the forms of local administration must also be modified. After our law is passed, the district will become the center of the zemstvos activity. Considering the enormous size of Russia, this measure alone is a very progressive step. We are giving the small peasant proprietors not only the management of the zemstvo, but also administrative powers. Our legislation is thus more advanced than any other in Western Europe. As to the district zemstvo, in future it is to exercise the functions of the provincial zemstvo. We are prepared to go even farther on the same lines. What will be the attitude of the small landowners and peasant classes towards national and cultural problems now that they have a hand in the administration of the zemstvo? The whole future depends on the answer. Can these classes surmount the difficulties of their task? Can they take care of the church? What will happen to the schools, the hospitals, and justice under their rule? The course of all future reforms depends on this. I have worked with P.A. Stolypin, added M. Krivochain, at improving economic conditions for the Russian rural population, and I have great faith in its patriotism. I want to keep my faith. Very soon we will take the daring but necessary step of laying the foundations of the future zemstvos and the Russian state. We believe that it will lead to the recovery of the creative forces of national culture. After this information reached them, the army and the peasants gave the temporary statute concerning the zemstvo and the prikaze concerning the land a very good reception. Right up to the last moment of our occupation of our native soil, the peasants were very favorably disposed towards our troops. The population realized that the authorities really did want to be guided by popular opinion and were doing their utmost to put into execution the measures they had drafted. When our troops left the Crimea, the new agrarian system and the Zemstvo statute, conceived, elaborated, promulgated, and executed within the remarkably short time of 6 months, had been gradually introduced into 90 of the 107 districts under occupation. It is possible that if this unanimity of opinion between the army and the peasants had been achieved at the time when the Russian army had been advancing victoriously on Moscow and nearly half of Russia was still free from the red yoke, the fate of the white movement would have been quite different. Who knows, perhaps the days of the Soviet power would have been numbered. By the middle of June, the necessary preparatory work for the application of the prikaz had been done. The largest tracts of land liable to expropriation were in the most recently occupied territories, Melitopol, Dniprovsk, and part of Perekop. The application of the prikaz to the land in this area, which was the one nearest to the enemy, obviously assumed special importance. Therefore, it was decided to appoint district agrarian mediators in these districts first, and only later on to districts farther south. The new agrarian organization was not set up in Yalta, because there were no great estates in that district, and the coast was given up to popular seaside resorts. Later, a district agrarian soviet was set up in the district of Baidory and was attached to the one in Simferopol. As soon as Berdyansk was occupied, an agrarian mediator was appointed there. At the beginning of July, the agrarian mediators, with adequate staffs of adjutants, surveyors, and agronomists, set out for their districts and began work. Towards the end of July, the elections for the district agrarian soviets had been held in a large number of districts, in spite of great difficulties which were the results of the times. Although it was the season when field work is at high pressure, the peasants voluntarily took part in the elections. It really seemed as if the worthiest representatives of the countryside were returned to the Soviets. Of those elected, a fairly high number were intellectuals, schoolmasters, justices of the peace, or agriculturists, as well as landowners. Sometimes there were even some of the great landed proprietors. The agrarian soviets set to work immediately after the elections. They worked on the returns of the reserve lands liable to redistribution amongst the cultivators, the fixing of the maximum amount of land assignable to new owners, a census of the average figures of the crops for the last 10 years, and so on. The normal maximum for the plots differed widely according to economic conditions, and these were very varied. There was not the same amount of reserve land in any two districts, but in every case land was allotted with an eye to the necessities of life. The allotments varied in size from 30 to 70 desiatu, and were even as large as 100 or 150 desiatins. In the Berdyansk district alone, they were as small as 20 desiatins, and a few plots in the Simferopol district were only 10 desiatings. Here fruit growing and market gardening predominated. When calculating the amount of land that the old owners were to be allowed, the agrarian soviets generally fixed it at 100 to 150 desiatins, but in a few cases they found it necessary to take the size of the owner's family into consideration, or the part he had played in the Civil War, or, above everything else, his personal administration of his estate, and whether or no he had improved agriculture on it. In a large number of cases, these considerations resulted in the amount of land left to the old owners being raised to 2, 3, 4, or even 500 desiatins, and in Simferopol even to 600. In revenge, there were also isolated cases in which the old owners did not get even as much land as the peasants. All this is abundant proof that the new agrarian institutions were applied with the utmost freedom, giving scope for local needs, ideas, and agrarian theories, and that the representatives of the Central Agricultural Authority, who were the colleagues of the local workers, had absolutely no idea of putting pressure on the work. It would be less than just not to mention here the zealous, energetic, and tactful work of that small staff who were recruited from amongst those who had helped in the execution of Stolypin's agrarian reforms and emigration schemes before the revolution. They were all experienced men devoted to their work. Unfortunately, many of them decided to remain in the Crimea after the evacuation and paid for their adherence to the White cause and their services to the people with their lives. When I submitted the agrarian question to the decision of the local institutions, I explained to the population the significance of my action and appealed to them to work with the army. At the same time, I expressed my belief that the new institutions, in performing their functions, would take the interests of national economy and national needs into consideration. Governments communique on the agrarian reform. My hopes were fully realized. The agrarian soviets responded enthusiastically to my appeal and did their work with scrupulous care. They were very anxious to settle the difficult problem before them equitably and in a way that would foster the development of the national economy. Little by little, the new power was revealing itself, and the populace realized that its face was terrible only to miscreants and traitors. Therefore, it inspired greater and even greater confidence. The flow of money from the depots into the savings banks, which were continuing to function in spite of the high cost of living, was a striking proof of this confidence. On May 29th, an appeal to the Russian people was published. People of Russia, hear why we are fighting. We are fighting for broken faith, for violated sanctuaries, for the liberation of the Russian people from the yoke of communist rogues and convicts who have shattered Holy Russia to her depths, for the ending of the civil war, for the giving of the land in full ownership to the peasant who tills it, that he may devote himself to peaceful work, for the sovereignty of real liberty in Russia, so that the people may choose their master for themselves. People of Russia, help me to save our country. General Wrangel,